thanks a lot for coming on the Radical Fabulatorium. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
It's great to be there.
So,
sort of in New Brunswick while not in New Brunswick. I'm actually in Montreal right now. So.
Exactly. Yeah, I was going to ask, you're based in Montreal at this point, right?
Yes. Yeah. But we're coming back this weekend. So my husband and I, we spend about half and half now, half in Montreal, half in New Brunswick. So
okay.
It's the best of both worlds.
Best of both worlds. And that's Moncton is what you would call home?
Well, I'm originally from Moncton.
Okay.
Born and raised, and then moved out to Montreal. But now, when we're in New Brunswick, we live in Coquang, which is our little paradise. It's a small fisherman's village between Shediac and Bouctouche. So
it's beautiful. I would imagine. Yeah, that actually leads me to a question I had on my list here. Is that being an Acadian, when you're in Montreal and you're speaking and you start speaking French with someone, can you tell right away whether they're Acadian or not? Is there like signs in their dialect or their accent?
Well, obviously, yes. There are expressions and even it's funny because I used to be perfectly bilingual. Now I'm losing a bit of my English because I don't get to practice or speak it much anymore. But even when I arrived here in Montreal, I was working a lot in English, actually. But I would always be told, can you lose that maritime accent? Because and I realized that there was an English maritime accent as well as a French maritime accent. Mm-hmm. But yes, obviously, especially in French, because where I come from in southeast New Brunswick, in French, a lot of the Acadians speak Czech now. And Czech is a specific type of language. It's like a vernacular, actually. Mm-hmm. Some would argue with me right now and say, no, it's an official language, and they're like the pros and cons for the Czech language. But definitely an accent, definitely expressions that are very different from northeastern New Brunswick, from La Péninsule.
Okay.
So, but that, you know what, that's proper to any country or province, I think, whether you be in Canada or in Europe or in the States, everybody has an accent. And I was lucky enough, like years ago, to do a documentary on that. So with Pilcomo, and we went across Canada trying to figure out where the accents come from and why some are still alive and why some have been lost over the years. And so it's what I learned the most is that the more you're in a secular environment, the more you keep your accents and expressions. And that's fantastic, actually. I love it. I love accents. I am, wherever I go, and I'm terrible because being also an actress, I always try to imitate them, or they get into my head and ear and I start talking like people that I listen to.
Okay.
I'm like the chameleon.
Interesting. So yeah, you kind of absorb it and adapt to it right away.
Yeah.
That's kind of so it sounds like that's a skill, but also sometimes it causes problems.
Yes, because some people I start talking and all of a sudden I'll switch into their accent and they're like, wait a minute.
Okay. That's funny.
Who are you?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I actually lived in Montreal for a couple of years, and je parle français un petit peu.
Oui.
But I was hoping to do this in English just to kind of cross over and introduce some of my English listeners to the Acadian scene.
Right.
And so when I was in Montreal and I was speaking, I mean, my French isn't super strong, but it was interesting watching some of the Montreal, Quebec French when someone was from France was like, I was working at a recording studio. So some artists would come over from France, and it was interesting watching them just kind of converse in the two different kinds of French. I don't know even sure how to say that. Yeah, absolutely. So that's fascinating. Maybe you could talk or give my English listeners a little more insight into Chiac. Do you know how that came about, or like, because in an Anglophone school system that I grew up in, people knew of Chiac, but it wasn't like one of those things we talked about seriously in any way because we didn't know anyone who spoke Chiac.
Right.
Yeah.
No, but well, as I said earlier, now it's sort of become a fashion, a way of speaking, which wasn't the case, even when I was in Moncton years ago.
Okay.
What happened with Chiac, it's actually a language that came about at the Industrial Revolution. because what happened is that the Acadians working in shops only had English manuals, so that all the terms would be in English. So they started using those terms because they had no idea what they were called in French.
Okay.
So the English sort of got into the French language. And then obviously most of the Acadians didn't speak English at that point. We're talking back in 1930. So they would take the English words and transform them into French, which gave le chiac. And some people often mistake le chiac from the old French, the old Acadian French, which is based more on the typical French, the old French from France, with all the expressions that have been kept in Acadia. But chiac is actually it's a modern language. It came about no more than 100 years ago. And now what's happened is that it used to be sort of a rebel language for all the young people. It was a way to distinguish themselves from their parents, from their authority. But now it's really become a way of speaking, and a lot of poets in Acadia and singer-songwriters are using chiac to really express themselves. So, and as I said, there's still the debate of whether or not it's appropriate or not.
Okay.
But it's definitely language we live with, and that it's important to understand where it comes from and what we want to do with it as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. That made me think of Simon Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you remember, but I was assisting Rachel with at
yes, of course I remember.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
And
you were working hard.
well, it was so exciting. It was my first time being involved in a project like that, and I have to admit, like I said, I understand French and I can speak some French, but I was quite nervous and a little scared. And also, to be honest, when I was taking in Les Éloises and listening to the music and the actors and the art and Gabrielle Boudreau, her dancing, I kind of felt strange that I didn't understand or know almost anything about the Francophone Acadian scene.
Right.
And that really came about for me working with Music New Brunswick, that I started to discover this. And anyway, it was just amazing. So Simon Daniel, his latest album is fantastic.
Yes, it is.
And would that be an example? Because he'll throw in lines that are English. But
absolutely,
that's kind of a good example of a chiac.
It's a really good example in the usage of it for poetry, because Simon is really a poet.
Okay.
So he uses the expressions, the chiac expressions, to create images that are accessible and yet for everyone, whether you're English or French. Everybody can understand because he works with images. Some other singer-songwriters will be more storytellers. You think of Lisa Leblanc. Lisa Leblanc is a storyteller in her songs. So she actually uses the chiac as she speaks. So it's not used as in poetry, but more is in the way she tells her stories, and that she would in speaking as well as in singing.
Okay.
So I think, I studied in literature, and linguistics was part of the program, of course. And any language that evolves is always interesting to study and to see how it will evolve over the years, because depending on the generations and how that new language is interpreted and seen by the educational system, the parents, and so on and so forth. So it's, I didn't grow up speaking chiac, and it was actually a problem, because being from Moncton as an Acadian, most of my friends did speak chiac. And at school, because I didn't speak chiac, I was often bullied, because people would say, "Oh, you speak French," and so. But now it's almost the contrary. I just went and saw a fantastic play called Parler mal by Gabrielle Boudreau and Bianca Richard. And it's all about that phenomenon in Acadia and how people, whether it the Acadians themselves, who have a judgment on who you are by the way you speak, which is completely absurd because language is only there to communicate. So the important thing is what you have to say and not the way you say it.
Interesting. So, yeah. So, okay, that's really fast. So it makes me wonder, like, so did rules, quote unquote, rules for Chiac they evolved naturally?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think so because, as I said, it started out as something that was important to work with. And then it became the language of the youngsters as a rebel language. And over the years, it's become definitely a way of expressing ourselves, and especially the younger generation. So now it's become really part of the language. And so, as I said again, the way it's going to evolve is yet to be seen, because a lot of linguists will say, well, you know, any language needs to evolve. If we would go back centuries ago, we didn't speak French the same way we do now, or English, for the matter of fact. So a language that doesn't evolve is a language that will eventually die. But what is recuperated within the space of time, only time will tell.
Interesting. Do you notice any Montrealer or like Quebecois artists who have absorbed some Chiac or like try to bring that into their art?
Well, I think what's happening, it's sort of like the way I see it, or evolving in the Francophone countries, is that English has been taking more and more space in the way of speaking. I tour a lot in France. Now in France, they don't speak Chiac, but they definitely use a lot of English words in the way that, you know, they will speak today. And the same thing is happening in Montreal, or in Quebec for that matter. But the difference is that they won't conjugate the verbs, or they won't use the English words and transform them into French. They use them as they are. But definitely it's changed, I think, all over the world, in the Francophone world. And again, you know, this is being carried out by most of the artists, the pop artists. And, you know, if the song is extremely strong, then maybe it will cross over, you know, generations. If the song is just a fly-by-night type of song, well, maybe it won't. So I think it's all a way as well of expressing your culture at the time and space that you live in. And when you study history, you see that many aspects of cultures will at one point be A, and then 50 years later it's D, and then it goes back to F, and it goes back to B. But there's always a little something that stays and is perpetuated throughout the evolution of a language or a culture, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about the way the language can evolve. Not to get too into the weeds, but I've always kind of wondered about I don't even know how to say it exactly, but tutoyer. Like in English, as far as I know, there's not really anything like that where you ask someone to tutoyer, or you need to be on some sort of, you have to have a relationship or a rapport before you tutoyer. And I was wondering if you could is there some way you could summarize that or express that to English listeners? Is there any way to like explain that?
Well, yes. You know, the only sort of example I would think of as far as the English language is the monarchy would speak in we the king we, the Queen, believe that. So there was this aspect of veneration, or that you are higher than. But in French, that always maintained in even the personal rapport between people, so that your parents, at one point, you would vous voir.
Okay.
They themselves wouldn't say, your father is this, but it was a sort of a way to respect different authorities and generations. The vous.
Mm-hmm.
Kids between themselves would tutoie themselves, brother and siblings.
Okay.
But towards their parents, they would vous voir them. Now that got lost as well in the last century, I would say. And now in Acadia, you can actually tutoie everybody.
Okay.
And it's interesting because being, living both in Quebec and in Acadia, here in Quebec, the vouvoiement has maintained, as far as if you know the person personally, or in the mark of respect and authority. I would go in a store here, and I myself will be vouvoyé by the salesperson, and I will vouvoie the salesperson. In Acadia, it's always tu.
Okay.
And it's funny because when I would come back to Acadia and realize that everybody would be tutoyé, it was sort of, I was sort of in a shock. I was like, well, wait a minute, I don't know you, and you don't know me. Mm-hmm. But now when it's the reverse situation, whether here in Quebec or in France, I miss the fact that everybody is on the same sort of level of, I will now tend to tutoie salespeople in stores, and now they look at me and go, why is she tutoying me? I don't know her.
Did we meet and I don't remember?
Yeah. But because there is something very amical. It brings you closer. It brings you to sort of the same level. There's no hierarchy. How do you say
hierarchy?
Hierarchy. Thank you. Which is nice.
Yeah.
Which is nice. But sometimes, I will never, ever tutoie my mother-in-law, for instance, who's 94 years old. I just, personally, I could never do that. Whereas I have friends that will definitely tutoie their grandparents. But my father was Scottish, part Scottish. And so my grandmother, Mary Mackay, was Scottish. And never in my dreams would I ever tutoie Nana. Nana to me was Nana vous, voyez, and also speaking English to her and not Gaelic. Never learned Gaelic really, but so there was always the fact that there was sort of a mark of respect towards your elderly.
Okay.
With the vouvoiement.
Okay. Maybe for English listeners, maybe it's comparable to the way that your father-in-law, you might say, like my father-in-law, his last name is Goodmurphy. So I might say Mr. Goodmurphy instead of saying his first name, Steve, unless he's specific, unless he was specifically said, you can now call me Steve. Yeah.
Right. Okay. That's exactly it. That's a really good analogy.
Okay. What made me think about that is I was watching your documentary, Racine Diaspora Égale, and there was a moment there where obviously you're excited to be talking to the person, and you're like, I think you said something like, I feel like I can tutoyer you naturally just because we're so connected here. Like I feel like we're family.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's really that's an interesting concept. So actually, I know I want to talk about this Acadian culture. So really, let me explain why I wanted to talk to you. It was purely just from Les Lois. It was just I just want to talk to you from the point of view of producing and putting together a show like that, and then having to. Like I can remember seeing you to the side of the stage, backstage, watching it unfold on the screen. And my mind was thinking, you put all this love and effort, like you specifically, but just anyone who's doing this job, love and effort in the rehearsals that are involved. But then when it's time to go, it's just like hands off and you're just kind of watching it unfold. And that's really kind of, I wanted to walk through that process of putting together a show like that. And it was only after the fact that I started doing some research and saw your documentary and started to listening to your latest record, which is beautiful. That I'm like, wow, like you have such a deep catalog of acting, everything. Anyway, I was really kind of blown away.
Oh my gosh.
But maybe we could think about Les Lois just for a little bit and maybe explain, like, I'm kind of curious, how early do you start working on a project like that? Yeah. Like how does it come together in the very beginning? What's the starting?
It's funny because I realized that it's always about 9 months, which of course to having a baby. And I think it's exactly that. Because we start, obviously I get the information about 9 months earlier when they know who the finalists are for the show. Mm-hmm. And from then on, I start doing my research. I try to read everything, listen, watch, and obviously they send me all the dossiers for all the artists that are finalists. But I go beyond that. I want to see what they've done outside of that category and see what they're capable of and what I can sort of do. Because as an artistic director, I always try to put myself back into my artist's shoes. Say, what would I like if I was on this kind of show and an artistic director would ask me to do this? So my goal is to have them do something they feel very comfortable in, because it's a huge show. It's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of pressure, as you saw. It's a big gala. But as well, I always try to give them a challenge, because I think that as an artist, that's what's the most interesting, is that you always push your own limits. And so that's why I try to mix people together and see how they can react one towards the other. And I think that makes for special numbers, and it makes for a unity in the show as well. Now with this year, I was very happy because I got to work with Brian Francis and Hubert Francis, because it's been a long time that Les Lois has been wanting to have Indigenous people on the show, because we know how important that relationship has been since the beginning or the landing of the Acadians in the Maritime provinces. And so when I was given like the green light to do a number with the First Nations, I automatically thought of Brian, because I've been following him for years, and he'd done this painting called L'Arrivée, which had blown me away. And so there again, I met with Brian, and we spoke a lot about what this relationship with the Acadians and Mi'kmaq people had been, and what it is now, and what we can do with it, and what's important to say in the number, in the space that we have to do this. So when I that was one of my first objectives, was to land this number, because to me it was the beginning of the story. It was the Big Bang for Acadia. And from then on, I created the show so that we would go from our history to today. And I really wanted to include the younger generations to the elderly generations. And Simon Daniel's song, which I hope everybody should listen to his album. As you said, it's such a wonderful album. Tunguska is about this sort of phenomenon that happened about a century ago in Russia, I believe, where there was this sort of big bang. Like they still can't really explain it, but it changed the face of that piece of land. And so I thought, wow, what an opportunity. I've got this artist who's done this like perfect song for the show I want to do. And
it's the starting number too. It's perfect.
Yeah. Exactly. So I could start the whole show with Simon. And then I thought of bringing Gabrielle Boudreau, because she's a young dancer who's just won the biggest dance show in Quebec and almost Canada, called Revolution.
The first
and I
Acadian.
wanted the first Acadian to win this dance battle. And she is a wonderful artist, a great creator. And I wanted those two artists to meet.
Okay.
They're sort of in the same space because she works with elements and she's really motivated by the text and beats.
Okay.
Which is, for a dancer to be really inspired by the text, it's not that often. So getting those two together was great for me. And I think, it did work out well. And then going from, working well the different disciplines, artistic disciplines in a show like Les Isabelles is also a big challenge because, when you're doing the Grammys, well, it's great. It's all music. So you can pick and choose who you want and do your story with different songs. But when you're doing these Isabelles, and that you have to have a dance number and an acting number and a literature number and a music number, my challenge is, how do I write my story with all these different disciplines? And I realized that I'm really excited to be able to do this because when you really follow through and see what every artist in every discipline has to say, you realize that whether you're a dancer, whether you're a writer, whether you're a musician, we all have a story to tell. And to combine these different stories, it's just a question of mingling them together the best way possible. And because they all have something to say, and it's beautiful and very inspiring.
And when you're putting it, the mix of the different artistic disciplines was like fascinating and amazing to me. And like, so when you're piecing together the show, were you kind of like stacking them, moving them around like a puzzle, or like in your mind? Because I'm imagining you don't really see it until we're there at rehearsals.
Oh yeah, no. I'm terrible because during the COVID, I started doing editing, visual editing, movie editing, because I come from a lot of the world of cinema and television, and I was always fascinated by it. When I would do movies, I would go into the editing with the director because I wanted to see how it was done. And so during COVID, I got the chance to really sort of specialize in editing, movie editing. Cool. So what I do usually is that I will think of a number and then I will create images and I will do a montage and see how it all comes together way before we get into rehearsals. Because we only actually have like 3 days of rehearsal, or even just 2 days of rehearsals before the show's aired. So no, I definitely test everything out before I get into the hall, because it's just not enough time. And I mean, it would take actually more like a week to really rehearse properly. So to skip all that rehearsal time that we don't have, I do all the montage, whether it's in writing, even like the theater, literature. I will read out myself the text, because I have to choose them. I have like 3 novels or five novels I have to work with. So I will read the whole novel and then choose specific passages from passage. How do you say that?
Passages. Yeah, that's right.
Passages from each novel to once again create one story. Because I'm to each artistic director's way of thinking or minding, but what I like is telling a story, and that micro story has to fit into the macro story.
Okay.
So I test it out. I record myself and I listen and I do montage, and then no, that works. No, that doesn't work. And this will be interesting. And what do I want to say with this show? So it's all thought of before.
Okay, very cool. You when you've settled on something that feels right, is it like an emotional reaction, or is it more like a logical, this follows that? How do you kind of how do you know that right isn't the right word, but how do you know it's the right choice, the right pattern?
Well, it definitely starts with an emotional connection that I will try to make work. And then again, when I start writing the show itself, I see if it can actually work with what was my first heart style. And sometimes I realize that no, that wasn't the best choice. So I will go back and listen until I find the right piece that will serve principally the artist. That's my main goal, is that they all be served, to their full potential. But, yes, I will at one point sit down and write the show and see exactly what piece of the puzzle works best in what area. And, it's like a pacing of any kind of music show. What the most important thing, I believe, as a musician, is that you create a voyage for your auditors or spectateurs, and that can only be done with the choice of songs and where you put them in your show. I always say I give des formations. How do you say? Oh my God, I'm losing my English. So sad. My poor dad, he turned in his grave. Workshops for singers. And I tell them every song has a function in a show. And if you put them in the right section, you will keep your audience, and you will give the song its best chance. Because if you might have an amazing song, but if you don't put it in the right place in your show, it will go unnoticed. Whereas if you bring it to the point where everybody's ready to listen to it, then your song will have its best chance in existing and moving people. Okay. Touching people.
Yeah, that's interesting. That I agree. And that makes me think of the way some artists order their albums, like the way that the track list on a record, because there's a number of my favorite albums that I would say the first song is perhaps one of the weakest songs on the record or doesn't represent the album.
Yeah.
And then a lot of listeners might listen to that one song and then they say, well, it's not for me. And meanwhile, me as a fan being like, no, just skip to 2. Start on track 2.
Yeah, exactly. Number 2 and number 5 usually are the best songs of an album. But, and now we're in an era where people are listening to shuffles. So it's when you're working on an album today, it's sad in a way because my husband and I, we still believe in that voyage. Whereas you bring your listener to a certain, space in their listening capacity. But now that actually people are throwing their songs in shuffles in Apple Music and so on and so forth. So Spotify. So you just kind of hope that there are still some people that, like me, back in the 80s, I would, sit on the couch and for hours on end, just listen to full albums, vinyls, when they weren't just fashionable, they were the only things we had. So I still believe in the voyage of an album.
Well, you're not alone. I feel the same way. And I sense that from your latest record, Brûle, maybe you can say so I don't say it wrong.
Brûle sur mes lèvres.
Yeah, brûle sur mes lèvres.
That's an expression, actually, to say it's burning on my lips. I need to say this.
Oh, okay. Like you have to speak. Okay.
I have to deliver this.
Okay. Yeah, and that album flows really nice. The arrangements, the string arrangements on that,
thank you,
are really beautiful. Yeah, the whole thing is great. Yeah.
Thank you. That was Yves Marchand and oh my gosh, the name will come back to me. but yes, we worked really, really hard on that album, and the strings were really an important part of it. I have a classical piano background, so I was born and raised in classical music.
Okay, cool.
As well as pop and traditional music, but the classical influence is definitely there in me, in everything I do. And now it's interesting because, I'm actually starting to work on my next album, and it's strange because I realize I have a lot of songs that I've written, but in different types of music. So it's like I have this English album that's been there for years, and I just can't figure out when to bring it out, whether I should do it now or because it's more folk type of music. In my mind, it's strange because when I write in English, I have a completely different. It comes out completely different than in French. In French, I'm definitely influenced by all the French text songs.
Okay.
And in English, it's definitely folk. So, and sometimes I'm going to mash up the two types of music, but that's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's really difficult. So I'm actually thinking now of doing like an EP in English and an EP in French, just so that all those songs get a chance to exist.
Yeah. Well, that'd be a cool side A, side B. If it was a vinyl, you have the English side and the French side. So
that might be it.
So when you're writing in English, it like changes the genre of music that's coming out of you. That's really that's interesting.
Yeah, because I definitely, I spent my whole adolescence listening to Pat Metheny and Neil Young and Joni Mitchell, Joan Baez, and all the David Bowie, and so it's a whole different world. And afterwards, when I came to Montreal and got into theater, I discovered all the French music, actually from France, and Jacques Brel and Barbara and all this. And I realized that touched a lot of where I came from my French culture. And so, it's not like I choose. I will wake up at night and I have this melody or these lyrics, and either they're in French or either they're in English, and they come out completely different. I'm Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
That's interesting. So would you say it's mostly a strength, or is that ever a weakness? Like, does that ever cause you trouble?
Well, only because then I have to choose. I have to choose, as I said, will I do an English album? Will I do a French album? And and I'm also, I've got this very strong, engagé side of me. I've always worked in organizations for social equity, and so there is a part of me, as far as the language goes, that I'm a huge defender of the French language and French culture, because I know that, it is difficult in North America to have it so that it can survive, actually. So I strongly defend French culture. But then I am part Scottish, and I love my English culture. And so I always feel like, oh my God, I've said this on Facebook about, how important it is to do French songs and to be, French literature and all this. And then, oh my God, if I come out with an English album, they'll think, oh my God, who is? She's phony. She's So I'm actually thinking of taking on maybe an English surname for my English music. I have no idea. You know what? In a way, it's just, I myself try not to have judgments on artists that will create one kind of album and then years later do another one, whatever language it is. So I will try to give myself that own freedom. Yeah,
no, I can understand the struggle, and I'll kind of be honest here, and it's not something that's super, super great to admit, but I remember growing up when I would hear a Francophone record or like a little bit of, I just, and I'm talking about when I was like in my teenage or early 20s and I was playing heavy metal. I just kind of like took it less seriously. Being in New Brunswick, like in an English environment and thinking about Hollywood and the big records, metal, like all these huge records in the music industry, it was all English in my mind. And I just will admit, I just kind of took it less seriously, which is now that I'm involved in Music MB and I saw Les Lois and I'm discovering all these Acadian artists and Francophone artists, it's kind of like, it makes me feel a little bit ashamed, but at the same time, I just didn't know. But I can understand what you mean by that struggle between, not necessarily wanting to put out an English record when you're so pro-French or
advocate of the French culture. And then I should say, well, my grandmother was Scottish. My grandmother was Scottish. I have the right to sing in English.
Well, it's difficult because everyone should, we're all humans first. So everyone should kind of, express themselves the way they want to express themselves. And like on my radio show, I've been trying to play more and more Francophone music that I legitimately enjoy. It's not just because I want to say, here's the Francophone stuff. I'm enjoying the music. So it's worth celebrating.
That is the great part of today's media is of how we can listen to everything, which is, I was in Turkey, touring in Turkey last September, I believe. And, when you travel and you get to listen to all the different meanings of expressions and means of expression, I should say, and the music and the influences that obviously, like in any country, they all have influences. And now the beauty of it is that you can be in Turkey and have an influence of what's being done in London or in China. And it gives for an amazing fusion of sounds and way of doing music, which is wonderful. So why stop ourselves to one thing when you can, hear and express something in many ways? As an artist, I think that's exciting.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you learn a new instrument, you'll write new riffs or new ideas purely because you're learning something new. So it seems like it might be the same way when you start to experience different languages.
Absolutely. An instrument will definitely sort of lead the way to what you're going to write or the way you play or interpret, whether it's as a musician or a singer. So these are all tools now that we have access to that we didn't before, whether it's just because we had no access to it or whether we just were in an environment where we didn't know it actually existed.
Maybe you could just talk briefly on, because you mentioned Turkey, a lot of people have different, like the way we view the Middle East over here is so, I don't know what the right word is, probably propagandized. And I spoke to, he used to play in a metal band and he's an Iranian Canadian, but he moved to Iran to play jazz music to kind of experience his family's culture and where they're from. And of course, Iran has all kinds of challenges, but we were talking about jazz music and performances and you start to realize like, wow, all the people there, like they're just experiencing music in the cafes and in the clubs like we are. Obviously they have their challenges just like we do. So when you went to Turkey, did you get any of that sort of feeling? Like did you notice a difference between how you felt when you were there and the way the crowds reacted versus any sort of preconceived notions or like any expectations you might have had?
Well, I don't know that I had expectations, to be honest, but it was very thrilling to go, exactly as you said, in cafes and little bars and have all these artists perform with their following. And everybody was singing exactly the way we do in bars. They know the songs and they're singing along. And the music is not, it has the culture's influence, but it's impressive to see how international music has become. So, we were in this bar and it was we're in Istanbul, and there's actually this bar called Montreal. a jazz bar. And so this artist came on, a singer-songwriter, and started singing, and everybody was singing along with him. And it was really like folk music, but with all the Arabic intonations, and obviously speaking in Turkish. And then a friend of his just arrived, a saxophone player, just jumped on stage with him. And then it became a whole different evening with these two interacting and playing the exact same way we do here.
Yeah.
And it was just, and everybody was like, yeah. And so it turned out to be an amazing evening in this little bar in Istanbul. And so, and then it's like anywhere else in the world. Then you'll go in a rural environment and they will have more traditional music playing. And then you have, parts of Istanbul which are very touristy, so that they will be playing Americana songs. But they always have their own artists, doing their own stuff in the midst of it, so that you realize how music has traveled so much and still travels so much throughout the world. And, as you were mentioning your jazz man in Iran, that's great. Mm-hmm. That's the beauty of it, is that when you have a chance to travel and even to live in different countries and then come back home, you bring all that influence in your luggage or your bagage, on dit en français. Mm-hmm. And it definitely leaves a trace. You can't travel and not bring back something that, not even consciously, it's there because you've heard it, you've been connected to it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I believe that, wherever you are in the world now, because of this global aspect of being able to listen to all different types of music, I think everybody's sort of, coming in and just realizing that music is a way of communicating. Mm-hmm. And whether, it doesn't matter what language you're singing in, doesn't matter where you come from, as long as you want to offer something. Mm-hmm. And that's what you get. I've had I have the chance to travel quite a bit, whether it was in Asia or South America. And I always came back with so many inspirations, and to see how wherever you are in the world, people are attached to their roots and to their culture. And I hope to God that will stay forever, that we will not all blend into this one type of music, because that's the world's biggest richesse, is to have your own specific way of communicating and bringing your art forward. Mm-hmm. And so, but the beauty of it is now that artists can travel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting thought, is that with the connectivity we have now, we can experience so many new things. But mm-hmm. I think you're right that sometimes that means a lot of the things can homogenize, or like a lot of things can start to replicate each other. So some of those cultures could get
blended out, which would be sad, mm-hmm. which would be very sad. Mm-hmm.
One thing that made me think of as well, sometimes I'll watch YouTube videos where people are breaking down the top 10 biggest songs on Spotify. Mm-hmm. And it's from an American or like a North American point of view. And a lot of times the host will be surprised by the songs that are in the top 10. But mm-hmm. it's kind of like when you think about the population numbers, it's way more people outside of North America. So like it kind of makes sense that the songs that are in the top 10 are not really what North Americans are necessarily listening to. But, we growing up before that connectivity, you're just stuck in your own continent, so it's just kind of a fascinating.
Well, you know what, I realize, because coming from another generation, sometimes even just watching the Super Bowl, mm-hmm. the halftime, who was it? Weekend performed 2 years ago, I think. I didn't even know who he was.
Okay,
And it was like, okay, this guy is being listened by millions of people. It's just because I'm not, I don't spend a lot of time on Spotify. I don't watch a lot of YouTube videos. And so it's like, oh my God, he's a phenomenon. And I don't know who the heck he is. I can't even remember his name. Blake? No, Drake.
Drake. Yeah, Drake.
Same thing. I was like, oh, isn't he Canadian on top of it? Or one of them is Canadian? And I was like,
yeah, they're both Canadian.
And I was like, I don't even know who they are. I'm still like, okay, I know who Madonna is. I know who J-Lo is. And so just that, to see, it all depends on where you listen or on what platform you listen to music. So it really does depend. And as you say, if you go in China, well, obviously the top 10 are not going to be the same as they are in America.
Yep. Which is kind of refreshing, as long as it continues to, kind of what you mentioned earlier, as long as they don't blend out of existence.
Exactly.
Maybe in the last few minutes here we have left, we could talk a little bit more about your experience in that documentary, Racine, Diaspora et Guerre. Specifically, I was kind of interested when you first would have went into that room where they had all the ancient, I don't know if ancient's the right word, but the old manuscripts or the old books. Kind of wondering what your emotional reaction was, or how kind of what was the feeling of being in that room with such old school writings?
I was incredibly moved because we take history classes, and as I say, we go on the internet and we see a lot of images, and so. But when you're there and you actually see the writing, the handwriting, and especially I think today, because we don't write anymore, we keyboard, and to see the writings, it all becomes real, because obviously it's a real person that actually wrote it down, and so history becomes reality when you see it in writing, when you're there, and it's books and books and books of pages and pages of people's lives being inscribed, and that with these books we know that it actually happened. We're not into maybe, it's a reality. And again, to be in France and having the history of Acadian people written down, realizing that because of the deportation, a lot of Acadians were sent back to France, and were treated as refugees.
Okay.
And that was incredibly moving and disturbing, because I'd never thought of the Acadian people as refugees. We all know about the deportation. We all live with that story, and it's part of the fiber of the Acadian people. But then to realize that the story also entails the story of refugees. And then all of a sudden, all the other stories come to life. The fact that ships and ships filled with Acadians were stranded, in the Antilles and in the Virgin Islands, and left to die on boats because people didn't want them. And you see what's happening today, and we're still there. There's so many refugees out there dying on boats, or shipwrecked, or just trying to survive, trying to go where they can actually envisage having a life. And it was, oh my God, well, wait a minute, this is my history of my people, which happened centuries ago. And you're watching the news that night, and you're, oh my God, centuries later, we're still seeing the same story. It's just that now there's so much of it that it's almost becoming like a way of living, which it should never, ever, ever be. So making this movie was, it definitely changed my life, to be honest with you, because it went from being a story to being a reality.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel very fortunate that I had the chance to do it. I'm very thankful to Phil Comeau to have thought of me telling this story with his movie of the Acadian diaspora. And to see that in France, some people really claim their Acadianship. And that, to think, we met somebody who was a descendant of an Acadian refugee, recounting the story that he went to Chipagan in New Brunswick years ago and met with his sort of cousin, which actually was, generations later, and that they actually really looked like each other. Mm-hmm. Everybody was, oh my God, they could be brothers. Mm-hmm. Yet neither families over 3 centuries had any idea they existed. And that's fascinating. Mm-hmm. How genes can definitely mark you and make who you are, whether you're conscious of it or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's wild to think of. There's really no way for that not to impact your outlook on it all. And
sorry, I just want to recount this anecdote because I'll be performing in le Congrès mondial acadien this summer in Nova Scotia for the spectacle de clôture with Zachary Richard. And le Congrès mondial is a place where Acadians from all over the world can meet up.
Okay.
And there are activities, there are shows, there are conferences, and especially family reunions. And years ago, I was singing in Ottawa, and I sang Evangeline. And this woman came up to me after the show, and she was crying. Oh my God, what have I done? And she said, I went to le Congrès mondial years ago in Louisiana, and I met with the descendants of my mother's side of the family that I only knew existed, but had never, and no way to reach out to them. Mm-hmm. So here's the story of the, men and women separated on different boats, men being sent one place and women being sent somewhere else. And so this husband and wife separated back in 1755, and in 1998, whenever it was the Congrès Mondial in Louisiana, the two families, the descendant of these two families, met for the first time.
Wow.
And that's it's powerful. It's incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could imagine that. And you've kind of, or maybe you don't know they exist, but even if you know they exist, but they're so disconnected. And even you mentioning Louisiana, there's probably a lot of folks out there who don't really understand that the Acadian culture traveled down to Louisiana and kind of morphed into the Cajun culture.
Absolutely. No, Louisiana was a French department, not long after Acadia was founded in 1604. And what happened is that during the deportation, a lot of Acadians went to and hid or were sent to Louisiana. And so there was a huge French contingent in Louisiana that helped Louisiana maintain a French culture as well. And obviously then, there was la guerre de sécession, and so Louisiana became part of the United States. And now they're dealing, where they've got a huge battle for the French culture, for the survival of the French culture. But I think it's a battle of any minority to be able to maintain a culture, and it makes who you are as well. I I'm very sad that the Acadian people had to go through have this history, but in a way, I know it makes for who I am as well. And so it's to have such a huge history. And it's very funny because, again, I've had the chance to perform in most of the Francophone areas in Canada. And all the other Francophones say, damn, those Acadians, they have the bigger history. How can we, we can't battle with you guys.
Yeah.
You get everything because you've got this amazing history. We weren't deported. We weren't,
Yeah, we had it easy.
We had it easy. So nobody's interested in us,
That's funny. Well, it's interesting at the beginning of the conversation, we were pretty near the beginning, you mentioned that you like to make the artists, like we were talking about Les Éloises, you like to give them some surprises or make them struggle or work for it. And maybe that's part of the Acadian culture, right? You had to struggle and work for it. So that kind of comes back around and is deep rooted.
Probably.
Yeah. So that's pretty interesting.
No, but it's, I feel very fortunate to, I've performed in a lot of places throughout the world, and I have done amazing movies and TV series and the music and writing and so forth. So that's the beauty of aging. You can have all these experiences and choose and pick from them. And especially when I get to do something like mise en scène or artistic direction, is to bring people together. And, I'm a huge advocate of culture and art. I strongly believe that we need it, and especially today, if we lose art and culture, the world will die.
Yeah, strong arts and culture is a sign of a healthy society.
Yeah,
I think anyway. Yeah, I completely agree. So on that note, let's anyone listening out there who's maybe thinking about becoming an artist or diving in, or you should share your voice, you should share your art.
Yes,
you should be part of the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Hear it. My mom used to say, si tu as du talent, c'est ton devoir de l'exprimer. So if you have talent, it's mandatory that you express it because it's a gift. It's something that a lot of people wish they had, but not everybody does have it. No, not everybody needs to say or express something. So if you have it in you, please, by God, do it. Do it.
I completely agree. And I'll just quickly, I can relate completely because I was a musician from my late teens right up to almost 30. And then I decided to step away from music and go back to school and get a quote unquote regular job, like an industrial job. And it didn't work out very well for my mental health. And then I was doing some reading and I came across a statement like that a lot of people wish they were creative or wish they could put something out there artistic. And that if you do have the capability to do that, you might have a responsibility to go through with it, whether or not the financial side of things work out. And it changed my life, really. It made me get back into it. And I wouldn't be sitting here right now without that thought process. So.
Exactly. You know what? And because when I do give these classes, and, today it's sort of easier to be a star. It's harder to be an artist. And art is what's going to transcend. Stardom is a passage.
Yeah.
But if you have something,
yeah, and stars fade, right? Stars fade.
Yeah, stars fade, but art prevails. And so again, if anybody out there has something they need to express, and it can be completely awkward at first, and it can be completely fantastic at first. You don't know. That's the beauty of art, is that you surprise yourself as it goes along, and it's between waiting for death comfortably or living your life thoroughly.
Get busy living or get busy dying.
Exactly.
To quote,
I'm gonna quote you.
That's not my quote. That's from Andy Dufresne on the Shawshank Redemption. Yeah.
Well,
It's
good quote.
it's a
Good
perfect quote. Yeah.
Perfect quote.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if you want to put out art and you want to put out music or whatever it is, you don't have to put it out with the intention of making any money at all. You can just put it out.
Yeah.
It's never been easier, and you can just do it for yourself, and you'd be surprised what might happen.
Yeah. If all the artists had waited to have the big car and the big house and the dog and the whole shebang, well, a lot of art wouldn't be existing today. So
Yep.
it'll find its way.
Absolutely.
Always.
Well, I appreciate you giving me so much of your time, Isabelle. It really was a fascinating conversation. I got to pick your brain about some Acadian stuff and artistic direction. It's so fascinating to learn all these things. So I feel kind of spoiled, to be honest.
Oh my gosh. No, it's great. No, that's the beauty of doing something. We did the Eloise together.
Yeah.
I saw you work you were working so hard, getting everything ready for the 3, 2, 1, go, action.
Yeah.
And it gave this which is fantastic. And I'm looking forward to listening to your stuff. And hopefully we'll meet again soon, Jay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Maybe next time we can do it in person if we happen to be in the same area.
Absolutely. Awesome. I would love that.
Very cool. All right. Thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the summer.
Excellent.
Right.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.